She didn't choose this war, but she's the only one who can finish it. Nyla Brooks spent her entire career being overlooked, mocked for her body, buried in a back office, treated like furniture. One late night, one encrypted file, one devastating discovery. And now the most feared man in the Midwest is standing in her office. And he hasn't come to negotiate. He's come to find a thief. What he finds instead will change everything. If this story is already pulling you in, hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The office had a smell to it after midnight. Stale coffee, recycled air, the faint chemical bite of cleaning solution the custodial crew sprayed on the carpet but never quite worked in all the way. Nyla Brooks knew that smell better than she knew her own apartment. She'd been breathing it every night for 6 months, bent over her second monitor in the corner of the 31st floor. Her desk pushed so far back from the main workspace that the overhead lights didn't quite reach her. They kept the good light for the people whose names were on the wall directory near the elevators. Nyla's name wasn't on the wall directory. She was fine with that, mostly. At 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, she was the only person still in the Caldwell and Pierce Financial Partners office on Wacker Drive, which was how she preferred it. No one to ask her to grab coffee, no one to talk over her in meetings she hadn't been invited to anyway. No one to make the quiet little jokes that everyone pretended weren't happening. The ones about her size, her clothes, her voice, the way she took up too much space in a firm that had decided years ago she was meant to take up as little as possible. She had her monitor, her spreadsheets, and a styrofoam cup of vending machine hot chocolate that had gone cold 2 hours ago. She was running a routine compliance audit on 3 subsidiary accounts attached to a holding company called Meridian Capital Solutions. It was the kind of work that made people's eyes glaze over when she tried to explain it at the rare moment someone asked, tracing wire transfers through layered shell structures, reconciling reported figures against actual movement, flagging anomalies for review. Tedious, invisible, necessary. Nobody thanked you for it until something went catastrophically wrong, and then suddenly everyone wanted to know why you hadn't caught it sooner. She almost missed it. The first anomaly was a rounding discrepancy. 0.003% variance on a $14.2 million transfer, which was technically within acceptable parameters and would have sailed through any automated review without triggering a flag. But Nyla wasn't running an automated review. She was running the kind of deep manual trace that nobody asked for and nobody appreciated, mostly because she'd had 3 hours of nothing and a professional instinct that had never once steered her wrong. She stared at the figure. She pulled up the originating account. She pulled up the destination account. She pulled up every intermediate account that had touched the wire in transit. And then she sat very still in her chair for approximately 4 minutes, which was how long it took her brain to fully process what her eyes were reading and to decide that she wasn't misreading it. The subsidiary wasn't a holding company. It was a washing machine, a sophisticated, multi-layered financial laundering operation that had been running, she was calculating fast, pulling dates, for at least 3 years, possibly 4, funneling money through Caldwell and Pierce's legitimate accounts, using a structure so carefully engineered that it had never once triggered an automated flag. Whoever built it knew compliance systems, knew what thresholds to stay under, knew exactly how to make criminal money look like the kind of boring institutional cash movement that put auditors to sleep. But they hadn't counted on Nyla being awake at midnight with nothing better to do. She pulled another thread. The money moved in from offshore accounts, Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, a registered entity in Singapore she'd never heard of, but whose registration number she jotted down on a post-it. It moved through Meridian Capital Solutions. It moved into a series of clean investment portfolios. And then, in amounts carefully calibrated to look like normal distributions, it moved out again. Real estate purchases, private equity stakes, luxury asset acquisitions, transformed into money that had a legitimate paper trail, money that could be spent without questions. Tens of millions. She kept pulling. Hundreds of millions. She stopped breathing for a moment. Over 4 years, the best she could calculate with what she had access to right now, the total figure approached $900 million. She sat back in her chair. The chair creaked. That was the only sound in the entire 31st floor. $900 million in laundered funds running through the firm she worked for in a structure so clean it had survived years of internal audits. Including her audits. She felt sick, Not because she'd missed it. She'd never been assigned to Meridian Capital Solutions before tonight. She was doing this audit because someone had reassigned their usual auditor at the last minute and dropped the file on her desk with a post-it that said, "Routine, due by Friday." She was doing it early because she always did her work early, because she had nothing else to do. She felt sick because she now understood, with the cold clarity that her brain produced when it was working at full capacity, and she wasn't allowed to stop it, exactly whose money this was. The Singapore registration number she'd jotted down, she'd run it through a cross-reference database she'd built herself, an unofficial tool she used to trace corporate structures through multiple jurisdictions. It took 45 seconds. The registered entity in Singapore linked to a parent company in South Korea. The parent company in South Korea appeared in 3 separate financial crime watchdog reports from the last decade, each time with its actual ownership anonymized. But the names attached to its board of directors, listed publicly before a corporate restructuring 6 years ago, were names she recognized, because she'd spent 3 months last year doing background reading on organized crime financial structures as a purely theoretical professional development exercise that no one at Caldwell and Pierce knew she'd done. Korean organized crime, sophisticated, transnational, with a known presence in Chicago, Vancouver, and Singapore. The money she'd been staring at for the last hour belonged to people who did not call lawyers when they had a problem. She needed to think. She needed to stop thinking and do something instead, because her brain was starting to spiral and spiraling was not useful. She looked at the files on her monitor. She looked at the archive drive plugged into the USB port on the left side of her computer, a personal drive she used for work backups because the firm's own backup system was 3 years out of date and she didn't trust it. She copied the files. She didn't let herself think too hard about why. She told herself it was professional instinct, documentation, the kind of redundancy that good auditors maintained. She told herself it wasn't because some part of her was already calculating that if anyone ever wanted this evidence to disappear, the first step would be making sure it only existed in one place. The copy took 6 minutes. She used the time to clear her search history on the compliance database and to make sure the audit log reflected only the legitimate surface-level work she'd been assigned. The deeper trace, the one that had led her to the Singapore registration number and the organized crime watchdog reports, that hadn't been run through the firm's systems. She'd used her personal tools on a private connection. Habit, professional paranoia. She'd never been grateful for her paranoia before. She ejected the drive, put it in her bag. She tidied her desk with the systematic calm of someone who was either very composed or was so far past panic that she'd looped back around to functional. She collected her cold, hot chocolate. She put on her coat. She went home. She did not sleep. The morning came in through the window of her apartment in the South Loop in gray strips through broken blinds she'd been meaning to replace for 2 years. Nyla lay on her back on top of the covers, still dressed, her bag on the floor beside the bed with the drive inside it. She'd been in that position for 4 hours. Her body felt cemented. She'd spent the dark hours making calculations that had nothing to do with numbers. Option 1. Report it internally. To her supervisor, Gregory Caldwell, yes, that Caldwell, the founding partner's nephew, who had made it aggressively clear in the 2 years since she'd worked under him that he considered her both professionally inadequate and aesthetically offensive. Report it to Gregory and watch it get buried in 48 hours, possibly along with her career, possibly along with herself. Option 2. Report it to federal authorities. The FBI, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, someone. She'd thought about this one the longest. The problem wasn't the reporting, it was the timeline. Federal financial investigations took months, sometimes years, and she was sitting on evidence that implicated a crime organization that had, according to the watchdog reports she'd read, demonstrated a consistent willingness to eliminate witnesses before federal investigations reached the indictment stage. She'd be walking into a process that would make her visible long before it made her safe. Option 3. Do nothing. Put the drive in a drawer, go to work, run the audit as assigned, flag nothing, file the routine report, and spend the rest of her career pretending she hadn't seen what she'd seen. She knew, lying there in her work clothes with the ceiling barely visible in the pre-dawn gray, that option 3 was the one a rational person might choose. She also knew she wouldn't choose it, not because she was brave. She wasn't particularly brave. She was stubborn, and she was precise, and she had, In the 26 years of her life, been told in so many ways by so many people that she didn't matter, that her intelligence didn't matter, that what she saw and thought and understood didn't matter. And something in her that was maybe the last version of herself that hadn't yet been worn down had decided somewhere around 3 in the morning that she was not going to be a person who looked away from the truth. Even if the truth was $900 million in blood money moving through her firm. She got up, she showered, she went to work. At 9:15 a.m., she was at her desk with a cup of coffee. Real coffee from the place on the corner, not the office machine, when she heard the elevators open. She didn't look up immediately. She had a report to finish. The morning had a normal texture to it. People arriving, keyboards, the low murmur of a phone conversation in someone's office down the hall. She was tracking the sound of the elevator as background noise until she registered that it hadn't produced the usual pattern. No small talk near reception, no immediate movement toward the kitchen or the far offices. The elevator had opened and then the floor had gone quiet. She looked up. There were 4 of them moving through the main office space with the particular unhurried efficiency of people who were accustomed to rooms clearing around them and found it neither remarkable nor satisfying, simply expected. 3 of them were positioned in a loose formation that her brain categorized immediately as security without being entirely sure how she knew. They were dressed well. No visible weapons, which meant nothing. They moved like weapons themselves, with their eyes finding and cataloging each person in the room in approximately the time it took those persons to realize they were being assessed. The 4th man walked ahead of them, and he was the one who made the room quiet. He was tall, not unusually so, but he carried his height as if it were a deliberate decision rather than biology. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who didn't have to think about cost. His face was angular, composed, ageless in the way of people who had moved through enough crisis that ordinary tension no longer registered. His eyes, dark and very still, were doing a systematic sweep of the room that had nothing casual about it. He was looking for someone. She knew it the way she knew a spreadsheet had an error before she'd found it. Pattern recognition, the slight wrongness in the texture of things. She looked down at her monitor. She became very interested in the audit report she was supposed to be filing. She heard him speaking to the receptionist, Diane, in a voice that was low and carried anyway. She heard Diane say something about Mr. Caldwell, and then she heard Diane go quiet mid-sentence in the way people did when they realized the question being asked wasn't about the thing they'd initially assumed. She heard footsteps on the carpet, coming toward the interior offices, and then a pause. She did not look up. You. The word landed like a finger tap on the back of her neck. Not loud, perfectly precise. She looked up. He was standing 3 feet from her desk, which meant he'd crossed the open floor while she was refusing to watch him, and he was looking at her with the complete focused attention of a man who did not look at anything without a reason. Nyla Brooks. It wasn't a question. She felt the inside of her chest tighten. "That's me," she said, and was faintly relieved that her voice came out level. "I am Kang Tai-jun." He said it the way people stated gravity, as pure fact, with no expectation of reaction either way. "I have an appointment with Gregory Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell's office is... I know where his office is." A pause. His eyes had not moved from her face. "I want to know who you are." The confusion that moved across her face was genuine, and she let it show because pretending it wasn't there would have felt like a tell. "I'm the forensic accountant. I work on compliance audits." "You ran a trace on Meridian Capital Solutions last night." The floor dropped out from under her. She didn't let it show. She held his gaze and kept her face very still and said, "That was an assigned audit, routine compliance. I filed the preliminary report this morning." "I know what you filed." Something in his eyes shifted. Not warmth, nothing that simple. More like the recalibration of an assessment. "I want to know what you found before you filed it." The room had gone very quiet. She was aware, without looking, that his security detail had arranged itself in a configuration that made leaving the immediate area more complicated than it had been 30 seconds ago. She was also aware that Diane was watching from the reception desk with the frozen expression of someone witnessing an incident whose category she hadn't yet determined. Nyla looked at Kang Tai-jun. She made a calculation. "I found a routine compliance report's worth of information," she said. which I filed this morning, as assigned." The silence between them lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then he said very quietly, "You are either very calm or very intelligent." "I'm a forensic accountant," she said. "I try to be both." Something that was almost not an expression moved across his face. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a card. Plain, matte black, nothing on it but a phone number, and placed it on the corner of her desk. He didn't push it toward her. He simply put it down. "That meeting will take approximately 1 hour," he said. "When it is finished, I would like to speak with you." He walked toward Gregory Caldwell's office. She looked at the card on her desk. She looked at the door he'd walked through. She picked up the card. The meeting ran 90 minutes. She knew this because she tracked it while appearing to do her work. And she actually did do her work, because she was capable of processing 2 things simultaneously, and because sitting still with no occupation was not something she could do right now. She ran reports. She cross-referenced figures. She drank her coffee. She did not think about the drive in her bag. She did not think about the card in her jacket pocket. She thought about numbers, which were honest things, which meant exactly what they showed you, and could not be frightened or pressured or talked out of their conclusions. At the 89-minute mark, voices elevated behind the closed door of Gregory Caldwell's office. She wasn't close enough to make out words. She didn't need to. The shape of the sound was sufficient, the flat, controlled register of a man who communicated through precision rather than volume, pressing against the rising, straining pitch of someone who had realized they were out of options and was attempting to escalate their way through that realization. She'd heard Gregory Caldwell try to escalate his way through things before. She'd never seen it work. At the 94-minute mark, the door opened. Gregory Caldwell walked out first. He was 51 years old, silver-haired, and accustomed to looking comfortable in expensive spaces because he'd never had to earn his way into them. Right now, he looked the way people looked when they'd been physically cold for a long time. White around the edges, a particular kind of stillness that came from controlling panic. He walked past her desk without looking at her, which was not unusual. He went directly to his assistant's station and said something in a low, urgent voice. Kang Tae-jun came out second. He paused at the door. His eyes found her across the office floor the way a compass found north. Immediately, without effort. He walked to her desk. He sat down in the chair on the other side of it, the chair that visitors used, that in 2 years she'd had approximately 3 people sit in, and he folded his hands on the edge of her desk and looked at her. "Tell me," he said, "what you actually found." She looked at him. She looked at his hands, still, controlled, the hands of someone who was used to having things in front of him that required management. She looked at the door through which Gregory Caldwell had disappeared. "What happened in that meeting?" she asked. "We discovered," Tae-jun said, "that approximately $47 million is missing from a set of accounts managed through this firm. Money that Gregory Caldwell was supposed to be holding in a fiduciary capacity. She'd missed that. She hadn't looked at Caldwell's personal management accounts because they weren't in her assigned scope. She made a rapid internal calculation and came to a conclusion that felt like stepping off a ledge. "He's been stealing from you," she said. "From the accounts I have placed in his management," Tae-jun said. "Yes. And the money in those accounts comes from—" "You know where it comes from," he said. "You found the structure last night." She said nothing. The absence of denial was, she understood, its own form of confirmation. He studied her. The quality of his attention was something she wasn't accustomed to, not the kind of attention that looked at her the way some men did, assessing weight and bone structure and clothing, all the ways a woman could be found wanting by a stranger's arithmetic. This attention was different. It was the attention of someone who was reading her the way she read a spreadsheet, looking for the actual structure behind the surface, finding where the real numbers were. "You're not afraid," he said. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation with a question embedded in it. "I'm afraid," she said. "I'm also sitting here having this conversation, so I'm managing it." "What do you want?" The question surprised her. Not because it was unexpected in context, it was exactly the question a man in his position would ask, but because of the directness. No preamble, no performance of negotiation, just the question. She thought about what she wanted. She wanted to not be sitting in this conversation. She wanted to have had a normal Tuesday night and a normal Wednesday morning and a normal career in which she ran her audits and was ignored and had the ordinary invisible life she'd been building. She wanted, specifically, the thing she'd never been offered, which was for her intelligence to be the thing that mattered in the room, rather than everything else about her that other people had decided was more important to comment on. "I want to know if I'm in danger," she said. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "From your organization?" He paused for half a second. "No, from the people who don't want what you found to become a problem for them. Gregory Caldwell, and others." His jaw moved slightly. "Caldwell has associates. Men who benefit from the structure you uncovered remaining uncovered. When they learn that an audit was run last night, they will want to know how much was found and who found it, and they will not want that person available to answer questions." She absorbed this. She absorbed it the way she absorbed a balance sheet that showed insolvency. With her whole body, the information landing in her chest and her stomach as well as her head, because some truths were too large to be processed only intellectually. "So I'm a loose end," she said. "You are a liability to them," he said, "which is not the same thing as what you are to me." She looked at him. "You found a financial structure that a team of very capable accountants spent 3 months looking for and could not locate," he said. "In one night, on an audit you were given accidentally." He paused. "Tell me how you did it." She told him. She didn't know why, exactly. Maybe because the math of the situation had become very clear very fast and she was running out of alternatives that didn't end badly. Maybe because there was something in the precision of his attention that reminded her of the best version of herself. The version that existed only when she was alone with a spreadsheet and nobody was watching to tell her she was doing something wrong. Maybe because she was tired. She walked him through the trace in 9 minutes. She watched him listen, genuinely, carefully, the way that almost nobody listened to her when she explained her work. No interruptions, no visible boredom, no glancing at his phone. When she finished, he said, "You have a copy." It was not a question. She didn't answer immediately. "I would," he said, "in your position." He looked at her bag. "You should keep it. It is your only leverage right now. I won't ask for it." She was quiet for a moment. "What are you asking for?" "Nothing today," he said. He stood up. He was tall again now that he wasn't folded into the chair, tall and composed and very certain of himself in a way that should have been irritating but wasn't quite. "Today, I am asking you to answer your phone when I call." He walked to the elevators. His security detail reformed around him without any visible coordination, like a tide pulling back. She sat at her desk and held his card between 2 fingers. Gregory Caldwell reappeared at the far end of the floor. He was on his phone. He wasn't looking at her, but one of his assistants was, the young one, the one who laughed at the jokes. And that assistant had the expression of someone who had just received information and was deciding what to do with it. Her phone buzzed, a text from a number she didn't recognize. "Do not go home tonight. I will explain when I call." She looked at the text. She looked at Gregory Caldwell's assistant. She started very quietly, very calmly, clearing her personal items from her desk. She left the building at 12:45 p.m. and took a cab to a hotel on Michigan Avenue that she'd never stayed at before it. The kind of mid-range business hotel that was busy enough for anonymity. She paid cash, which she'd gotten from an ATM 2 blocks from the office on the way out, walking the long way around through the parking structure to make sure no one had followed her from the building. She wasn't certain she hadn't been followed. She was fairly certain. It would have to be good enough. The room was on the 14th floor, overlooking the street. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the drive in her hand. She thought about what she knew. She knew that $900 million in laundered money had been running through Caldwell and Pierce's accounts for at least 4 years. She knew that Gregory Caldwell had, apparently, decided at some point that skimming from that arrangement was a manageable risk. She knew that the people whose money it was, that Tae-Jun and whatever he represented, had come to the office this morning to confront Caldwell about that theft. She knew that she had been seen. She knew that Tae-Jun had somehow known she'd run an audit the previous night, which meant either he had access to the firm's internal systems or someone inside the firm had informed him, both of which were alarming in different ways. She knew that her name was now in the middle of something that had been invisible 12 hours ago. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen, the same number as the text. she answered. Where are you? Taejun's voice was exactly as she remembered it, low, precise, carrying. Somewhere safe, she said. Are you certain? She thought about that. More certain than I'd be anywhere else. A brief pause. Caldwell made 3 calls after you left the building, 1 to an attorney, 2 to other numbers. Another pause. I have people watching his activity. One of those numbers belongs to a man named Anton Vance. You do not need to know who he is except that you should not be where he can find you. She didn't ask how he knew about the calls. She filed that information instead. I wasn't going home, she said. Good. She heard something in the background, a car door, the flat echo of an enclosed space. I need you to tell me something. Caldwell's operation. The accounts he manages for us. You know the structure now. You know how he built the concealment. Tell me how he moved the $47 million without triggering detection on our end. She thought about it for 30 seconds. She thought about the accounts she'd seen last night, the structure she'd traced, the points in the flow where manual intervention would have been required versus automated. Secondary adjustment entries, she said. He would have made tiny fractional adjustments across hundreds of accounts over time, each individual entry too small to flag, but collectively representing the diverted amount. It's the same structure he used for the original laundering system, actually. He adapted his own concealment technique. Silence on the other end. He used our own architecture against us, Taejun said quietly. He built a house with a secret door in it, Nyla said, and then he used the secret door to rob the house. Yeah. Another silence, then, how long before you'd know exactly where the $47 million went? She thought. Give me the account access in 8 hours. I'll give you 6, he said, and send a car. I'm not going anywhere with a car you send, she said immediately. I don't know you. The silence this time was different. That is, he said carefully, a reasonable position. Thank you. I will send the account access to a secure email. You will have it within an hour. You can work from where you are. A pause. And you will answer my calls. We'll see, she said. She heard what might have been something not quite a sound, the near absence of a reaction from a man who was probably not accustomed to "we'll see" as an answer. She hung up first. She sat on the edge of the hotel bed with the drive in her hand and the knowledge settling in her chest with the weight of something truly heavy, that she had just made a choice that changed the shape of the next period of her life, and possibly longer. Then she opened her laptop and got to work. The account access arrived in 44 minutes. She spent the first 20 minutes just mapping the structure, the way a surveyor maps terrain before deciding where to walk. The accounts were sophisticated, layered through 6 jurisdictions, with the kind of institutional legitimacy that came from being legitimately managed by a prestigious firm for long enough that the financial system had simply accepted them as furniture. She went through them the way she went through everything, systematically, without expectation, following the actual movement of actual numbers, rather than looking for what she expected to find. She found the adjustment entries at the 3-hour mark. They were exquisite in a horrible way, the work of someone who genuinely understood concealment, who had spent years developing patience for the long, slow bleed rather than the dramatic withdrawal. Caldwell had been taking from these accounts for almost 2 years, she calculated, in amounts calibrated to fall below every monitoring threshold. The total at current prices was closer to $51 million than 47. Either Taejun's team had been working with incomplete information, or Caldwell had moved more recently than they knew. She traced the exit path. The money had moved through 4 intermediary accounts in 3 countries and landed, ultimately, in a series of real estate holdings in Miami and a private investment portfolio registered under a trust name she didn't recognize. She called the number. It rang twice. You found it, Taejun said without preamble. $51.3 million, she said, not 47. He's been running this for 22 months, and he moved more recently than your information reflects. The funds are in real estate in Miami and a private trust. I have the registration numbers. A pause. Send them. Secure channel only. Another of those near pauses. I'll send you one. She sent the information. She sat back and looked at the ceiling. She'd been running on the particular fuel of crisis for 16 hours. The sharp, clarifying energy that came from having a problem important enough to make everything else irrelevant. She could feel the edges of it starting to soften. Underneath it, when she let herself notice, was something that wasn't quite fear but was adjacent to it. The awareness of how far outside her normal frame she was. How there was no audit trail for this. How nobody knew where she was except a man she'd met 9 hours ago whose money had started all of this. Her phone lit up. Not a call. A notification from a news aggregator she kept on her phone for financial stories. The headline stopped her. Prominent financial advisor found dead. Gregory Caldwell, 51, apparent accident. She stared at it. She read the article 3 times. Gregory Caldwell had died at 2:47 p.m., the article said, in what was being described by Chicago police as an accidental fall at a construction site near the River North neighborhood. The investigation was ongoing. She sat in the hotel room on the 14th floor, and she breathed very carefully, and she understood, with the same cold precision that she brought to every truth she uncovered, that she was no longer dealing with the aftermath of a financial crime. She was dealing with something that killed people. She called the number. "I know," Tejun said before she could speak. "Did you?" "No." A pause. "Vance. The man you mentioned. Caldwell became a liability when it became clear he'd been discovered. Vance eliminated the liability." Another pause, shorter. "You are now the primary witness to the financial structure Caldwell managed, which means you have moved up significantly on the list of people Vance considers liabilities." She was quiet. "I need you to listen to me," he said, "not as a man with authority over you, as someone whose interests align with yours, surviving the next 24 hours. Go ahead," she said. "You cannot stay where you are." "The hotel," he stopped. "You paid cash?" "Yes." "Good. Cameras, though." "You were seen. They have resources." He was moving as he spoke. She could hear it, thus the slight shift in his voice's acoustic environment. "I have a car 2 blocks from the Michigan Avenue Marriott. There is a woman at the wheel named Ji Hye. She will show you a specific number written on a piece of paper when you approach. The number is 4417. If she shows you anything else or no number, you don't get in." She absorbed this. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. A beat. "Because you found in one night what I have been trying to locate for months," he said. "Because my organization is currently under significant pressure from entities that are using financial systems I cannot read, and because you are the only person I have encountered who might be able to read them." She looked at the drive on the nightstand. "Also," he said, and something in his voice shifted almost imperceptibly, "you hung up on me." She would have laughed, maybe, under different circumstances. 4417, she said. 4417, he confirmed. She packed in 4 minutes. She'd packed light coming in, professional habit, slung her bag over her shoulder, checked the hallway, and walked to the elevator. 14 floors down. Through the lobby without looking at anyone. Out through a side door to Huron Street. 2 blocks. In the late afternoon cold with October air pressing against her face and the sound of the city going on around her in complete indifference to the fact that her life had reorganized itself entirely in the last 18 hours. The car was a black SUV. The window came down as she approached. The woman inside, early 30s, sharp-featured, her expression professionally neutral, held up a piece of paper. 4417. Nyla looked at the number. She looked at the city behind her. Her city. The city she'd lived in for 26 years. The skyline she could identify with her eyes closed. The streets she knew by transit line and walking time and neighborhood character. She thought about Gregory Caldwell in a headline, and Anton Vance, whose name she still didn't know enough about, and $900 million moving through the dark, like water through pipes nobody was supposed to know existed. She thought about the drive in her bag and the work she'd done and the truth she hadn't been able to look away from. She opened the car door and got in. The SUV pulled into traffic. The city fell away behind the tinted windows. And Nyla Brooks, who had spent her entire professional life being invisible, was being taken somewhere by a man she didn't know for reasons she only partially understood, carrying evidence that could end careers and lives, including possibly her own. She stared straight ahead. She breathed. She did not look back. The SUV smelled like leather, and something else. A faint chemical undertone she couldn't identify, clean in the way of spaces that got cleaned deliberately rather than casually. Ji-hye drove without speaking, both hands on the wheel, her eyes moving between the road and the mirrors in a rhythm that looked less like caution and more like professional habit. She checked the mirrors every 8 to 11 seconds. Nyla counted, because counting was what she did when she was trying not to think about the thing she was actually thinking about. Gregory Caldwell was dead. She'd met him 487 times, approximately. She'd calculated that once, bitterly, as a way of documenting the accumulated weight of being condescended to by one specific human being over 2 years. She'd sat across from him in performance reviews where he'd described her work as adequate, while the firm was charging clients for it as exceptional. She'd listened to him explain twice that her presentation style needed work, which was a way of saying that a black woman with her build made certain clients uncomfortable, which was a way of saying that she was inconvenient for the brand. She had never liked him. She had also never wanted him dead, and the fact that he was dead, efficiently, quickly, cleaned up like a clerical error, made the inside of her chest feel like wet concrete. The SUV left the city grid. She watched the GPS on the dashboard. She couldn't see the destination, just the moving blue line. North, lakeshore, then northwest. "How long?" she asked. 2 hours, Ji-hye said. First word since the car door closed. Her English was precise, lightly accented. "Sleep if you can." Nyla didn't sleep. She sat in the back seat with her bag on her lap and the drive inside the bag and watched the suburbs dissolve into exurbs and eventually into the kind of dark that only existed when you got far enough from the city that the sky remembered it was supposed to have stars. The estate appeared at the end of a private road that went on long enough to make a statement about it. Stone gate, motion activated, no visible guards at the entrance, but 2 points of elevated camera coverage that she spotted and 2 more she suspected. The grounds were large. She estimated maybe 4 acres immediately around the main structure, with a perimeter that extended further into tree cover. The house itself was a converted lake property, the kind that had probably been a wealthy family's summer compound in a previous decade and had since been reinforced and extended into something that was still architecturally residential but functioned as a secure facility. 3 visible outbuildings. Underground parking structure to the east side, indicated by a ramp she could see from the driveway. Lake Geneva lay flat and black beyond the property's rear, reflecting a partial moon. It was, she thought, extremely beautiful and extremely trapped-looking, and she wasn't sure which one was the correct reading. Ji-hye brought the SUV to a stop at the main entrance and killed the engine. She looked in the rearview mirror at Nyla, and for the first time her expression shifted slightly from professional neutral, something almost sympathetic, or maybe something that had simply been worn to the shape of sympathy by proximity to enough difficult arrivals. "There will be an orientation," Ji-hye said. "Rules of the property, security protocols. Someone will walk you through it tonight." "And Tae-jun? He'll see you in the morning." Nyla looked at the house. She looked at her own reflection in the window, ghost pale over the dark exterior sun. Her coat, her bag, the particular exhaustion in her face that she recognized as the kind that sleep didn't fix, the kind that came from metabolizing too much truth in too short a time. "Okay," she said. She got out. The room they gave her was on the second floor, east wing, with a window that looked toward the lake rather than the road. It was clean, spare, functionally comfortable in the way of spaces designed for practicality rather than hospitality. A bed, a desk, a bathroom, with new soap still in the wrapper. Someone had put a glass of water on the nightstand. Small thing. She noticed it. She did not sleep until nearly 4 in the morning. When she did, she dreamed about spreadsheets filling themselves in with numbers that kept changing before she could read them. She was up at 6:30 with the gray light and down to the main floor by 7:15, following the smell of coffee like a rope through a dark room. The kitchen was large, institutional in its equipment, and occupied by 2 people. A man in his mid-40s she hadn't seen before, sitting at the counter with a tablet and an espresso he wasn't drinking, and Tae-jun standing at the window with a mug in his hand, looking at the lake. He heard her come in. She could tell by the slight shift in his posture, a millimeter, the adjustment of a man who registered everything. "There's coffee," he said without turning around. "I see it." She poured herself a cup. The other man looked up at her from behind the tablet, assessed, returned his eyes to whatever he was reading. She was used to that sequence. She let it pass. She stood at the opposite end of the kitchen island from Tae-jun, holding her mug, and looked at the back of his head. He was dressed more simply than the day before. Dark pants, a plain gray shirt, no jacket. He looked like a different category of person without the suit. Not softer, just less composed around the edges. More actual. "You should have slept," he said. "I did." He turned. His eyes went to her face the way they had the day before. Immediate, assessing, looking at the actual thing rather than the surface of it. He looked like he didn't entirely believe her. He also didn't push it. "Sit down," he said. "We need to talk about why you're here." The man with the tablet was named Park Soo-han. He was Tae-jun's head of financial intelligence. The title was delivered flatly, without elaboration, in the way that titles were delivered in spaces where everyone already knew the hierarchy and the titles were for the newcomer's benefit. He was precise, competent, and made no visible effort to be anything other than mildly hostile to her presence. He placed the tablet on the island between them, and on the screen was a financial map. Accounts, connections, flows, that she recognized immediately as the kind of visualization she'd have built herself given the right data in 3 days. It was sophisticated and it was wrong in 2 places that she could see at a glance. "This is the current model of the Belandi organization's financial network," Tae-jun said. "Marco Belandi. He runs the primary rival organization in the Midwest and East Coast. For the last 8 months, he has been systematically targeting our operations, client relationships, supply chains, personnel. He knows things he should not know. He moves money in ways that our analysts cannot track." He looked at her. "Soo-han has been working this problem for 4 months. Soo-han said nothing. His jaw was tight. "And?" Nyla asked. "And he cannot crack it," Tae-jun said simply. Soo-han's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, barely, tightly, the movement of a man absorbing a hit and refusing to show the landing. "I need to understand Belandi's financial architecture," Tae-jun continued, "where the money originates, where it moves, where it's vulnerable. If I can see his money, I can see his operations. And if I can see his operations, you can stop him," Nyla said. "I can end him," he corrected quietly. She looked at the tablet. She looked at the map on the screen. She was already seeing the problems, the wrong assumptions built into the model's structure, the places where Soo-han's team had followed the visible accounts and missed the layer underneath. She looked up at Soo-han. He was looking back at her with the controlled flatness of someone managing active resentment. "Can I access the raw transaction data?" she asked. He looked at Tae-jun. Tae-jun said, "Yes." Soo-han's jaw tightened another millimeter. He picked up the tablet. He didn't hand it to her directly. He set it down on her side of the island and withdrew his hand, a motion that was technically cooperative and felt like a declaration of war. She pulled the tablet toward her and got to work. By the second night, she'd rebuilt the entire model from scratch. She'd been given a workstation in what they called the command center, a room below the main floor with reinforced walls and a server setup that was impressive enough that she'd stood in the doorway for almost 30 seconds before walking in. She'd been given access credentials, a cleared secure line, and a list of data sources that Soo-han's team had compiled over 4 months. She'd used about 30% of the list and supplemented the rest with her own sourcing methods, which she did not explain in detail because they were hers, and she was not in a position yet to make herself any more transparent than she already was. The model that emerged was different from Soo-han's in ways that mattered. She found Belandi's real architecture on the second morning, not through the obvious channels, the shell companies in Panama and Delaware that Soo-han had correctly identified, but through the secondary layer that existed specifically to make the Panama companies look like the bottom of the structure when they weren't. The real accounts were in 3 financial institutions in Eastern Europe, routed through a series of micro-investment vehicles that piggybacked on legitimate regional economic development funds. It was a newer technique. She'd read about it in a theoretical context 6 months ago, in a forensic accounting journal that had maybe 300 readers globally, and 0 of them worked in organized crime intelligence. Except, apparently, whoever had built Belandi's system. She sat with that for a moment. Then she printed the map and took it upstairs. Taejun was in a meeting when she arrived. His security detail, different faces than Chicago, but the same quality of professional stillness, indicated she should wait. She waited in the hallway for 11 minutes, which she spent reviewing her own notes on a pad she'd found in the command center. The door opened. Two men came out, followed by Taejun. He saw her. His eyes went to the papers in her hand. "Now?" he asked. "It's better if it's now," she said. He told the two men something in Korean. They left. He held the door open. Inside the room, a study, maps on the wall, the kind of workspace that looked used rather than staged. She spread the papers on the table and walked him through it in 18 minutes. He asked 3 questions, each one precise, each one landing exactly on the point where she'd anticipated uncertainty. She answered them. He looked at the map. "Eastern Europe," he said. "The infrastructure's already in place from older operations," she said. "It's cheaper to adapt than to build new, and it's outside the jurisdictional focus of the U.S. authorities who would be most interested in Belandi." How did Suhan miss this? She chose her words carefully. He was following the layer that was built to be found. The visible structure is sophisticated enough to be convincing as the real one. You'd have to have a reason to suspect it wasn't the bottom, and you had a reason. I read a paper 6 months ago about this exact technique used in a Ukrainian financial crime case. It was theoretical, describing what the architecture would look like if someone applied it to an organized crime network. Someone applied it to an organized crime network. She paused. I think whoever built Belandi's system read the same paper. Taejun looked at her for a moment. Or wrote it. She hadn't considered that. She considered it now, and the weight of it settled on her the way good intelligence always did, with the particular gravity of a fact that reorganized everything adjacent to it. "I'll look at the authorship trail," she said. "Yes," he said. "Do that." He straightened up from the table. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since Chicago, with that full, undivided attention that she still wasn't entirely sure how to receive, because it wasn't a kind she'd been given before. Not like that. Not with that quality of being actually seen. "You should eat something," he said. "You've been in the command center for 14 hours. 16, she said. 16. He almost said something else. He didn't. "There's food in the kitchen. Ji-hye will show you." She collected her papers. She was at the door when he said, "Nyla." She turned. "In 4 months," he said, "Suhan's team produced a model that was 60% accurate. You produced one that is, I believe, correct in 2 days." He paused. "I want you to understand that I recognize what that means." She looked at him. "Okay," she said. She left. She stood in the hallway and breathed very carefully and told herself that it was just competence being acknowledged, that it was a professional observation from an employer in a complicated situation, that the thing happening in her chest was just relief at having her work seen and not anything more complicated than that. She went to find the kitchen. The argument with Suhan happened on the 4th day. She'd known it was coming. She'd felt it building in the architecture of every interaction. His eyes when she walked into the command center, the particular way he communicated necessary information in the minimum words possible, and then went back to his own station, the temperature of the room dropping 2 degrees every time she corrected an assumption in the shared working model. She didn't try to manage it. She didn't know how to manage it. She'd spent her career being managed into smaller spaces, quieter behavior, less visible presence, and she'd never learned how to do the opposite. It broke over a disagreement about a data set. She'd flagged a discrepancy in the Belandi network model that suggested a secondary operational cash flow they hadn't accounted for. Suhan said she was wrong. He said it with the clipped confidence of someone who had been right in this room for 4 months and found the challenge structurally inconvenient. She showed him the figures. He said she was misreading the account structure. She showed him why she wasn't. He stood up from his station. He was taller than she'd registered when he was sitting, broader too, with the coiled energy of someone who was very good at things and found it physically uncomfortable to be in proximity to someone who was better. "You have been here 4 days," he said. "I have been running this analysis for 4 months. With a team. With resources you have not used and methods you have not asked about. I know, she said, and the secondary flow is still there. It is a variance in the reporting period data set. It's not a variance. A variance would be random. This is consistent across 19 months at the same ratio. She pulled up the figures on her screen and turned the monitor toward him. Look at the ratio. He looked. His jaw was working. It's a second operation, she said more quietly. Not big. Maybe 12% of total cash flow. But it's separate. Different origin, different destination structure. Someone inside Belandi's network is running a side business that Belandi might not know about, or might know about and be hiding from his own accounting. The room was very still. The two other analysts at their stations were performing the intensive focus of people who desperately did not want to be noticed. Suhan looked at the screen for a long time. Pull the 19-month window, he said finally. Not to her. To one of the analysts. The analyst pulled it. The ratio was there. Suhan turned and walked to the far end of the room and stood with his back to her for a moment, his hands at his sides, and she understood he was doing the same thing she did when she was absorbing a truth she didn't like, breathing through it, finding the edges of it, deciding what it required of him. He turned back. I'll run the origin trace, he said. On my side. Okay, she said. He went back to his station. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a conciliation. It was the thing that happened between two people who were both too invested in the actual problem to keep performing the conflict, the moment where the work won. She turned back to her own monitor. She realized, somewhere in the next 20 minutes of silence, that her hands had been shaking slightly. She pressed them flat on the desk and breathed until they stopped. She found Tae-jun at the edge of the lake at 9 that evening. She hadn't been looking for him. She'd gone out through the back of the house because 14 hours in a room with screens and recycled air had produced in her a physical need for outside that was almost desperate, and the lake was there, and the night was cold but not violent about it, and the dock extended out over the black water like a way out of something. He was standing at the end of the dock with his hands in his pockets, looking at the water. He heard her come out. She was becoming accustomed to his hearing, which seemed to operate at a frequency that didn't miss much, and he turned his head slightly. She walked to the end of the dock anyway. She stood beside him, not close, with a few feet between them, and looked at the water. Can't sleep? She asked. I don't sleep much, he said. Me neither. Usually. The water moved against the dock pilings in small, irregular sounds. The air smelled like cold and lake, and something organic underneath. Suhan spoke to me tonight, he said. About the secondary flow? About you. He looked at her sideways. He said, and I want you to understand that for Suhan, this constitutes high praise. That your analytical instincts are not as problematic as initially assessed. She made a sound, almost a laugh. He's good, she said. His original model was genuinely good. He just built it on one wrong assumption, and the error compounded. He knows that now. I know. She looked at the water. I wasn't trying to show him up. I know, Tae-jun said. So does he at this point. A pause. That is not the part that bothers him. She waited. The part that bothers him, Tae-jun said, is that you did in 4 days what he could not do in 4 months. And he is a man who has structured his identity around being the most capable person in any room he enters. He paused. It is a fragile way to build yourself. But it is the way he has built himself, and I do not know how to tell him that. She looked at Tae-jun's profile. The sharp line of his jaw, the particular stillness of him, the thing underneath the stillness that wasn't quite visible but was there if you knew what to look for. She'd gotten better at looking for it. How do you build yourself? She asked. The question came out before she'd decided to ask it. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. On results, he said. Not on being the best in the room, on whether the outcome is what it needs to be. He looked at the water. I have been wrong many times, about many things. A pause that had weight in it. What I try not to do is be wrong twice about the same thing. She didn't ask what he was referring to. She didn't think she was supposed to. The secondary flow, she said after a moment. If it's someone inside Belandi's network running independently, that's leverage. That's a fracture point. Yes. If we can identify who it is and what they're running, we might be able to use it. either to get information about Belandi's main operation or to create a disruption, he said. Yes, I've been thinking about the same thing. Suhan's running the origin trace tonight. I know, he told me. They stood in silence for a while. The water moved. An animal made a sound somewhere in the trees at the property's edge. A bird probably, though she didn't know enough about birds to be certain. You should sleep, he said. So should you. I will, he said. Eventually. She went inside. She lay in the bed in the east wing room with the lake outside the window and the drive on the nightstand and thought about the dock and the water and the particular quality of standing next to someone who looked at things the same way she did. Not the same conclusions, not the same information, but the same orientation toward truth. Toward the actual shape of things, rather than the shape things were supposed to have. She thought about how that was probably the most dangerous thing she'd encountered since Tuesday. She fell asleep before she finished the thought. Oh. The origin trace came back at 6 a.m. Suhan sent the results to both their stations simultaneously, which was, she understood, his version of an olive branch. She read them in bed on her phone, with her coffee cooling on the nightstand. The secondary operations cash flow didn't originate with Belandi's known partners or suppliers. It originated inside Taejun's own network. She sat up. She read it again. The money flowing into Belandi's hidden secondary accounts. The operation within the operation that she'd identified through the ratio discrepancy, was coming from a source that her current access credentials identified only as internal account reference 7 Kang. Her access credentials didn't have clearance to see what internal account reference 7 Kang was. She was already out of bed and pulling on her jacket when her phone rang. Suhan. You saw it, he said. I saw it. I don't have clearance to identify the account either. His voice was flat, controlled, with something underneath it that wasn't either of those things. I'm going to Taejun. I'll come with you. No. A pause. Let me go first. She stopped with one arm in her jacket. She thought about it. She thought about Suhan and 4 months of work and a wrong model built on a wrong assumption, and she thought about the olive branch of simultaneous results, and she thought about the fact that some information needed to land in a certain order to be receivable. Okay, she said, I'll be in the command center. She waited 40 minutes. The command center at 6 a.m. was empty. The other analysts didn't arrive until 8. She sat at her station and she ran secondary verification on the account trace, and the results came back the same every time, and she sat with the knowledge of what they meant and felt it settle on her like the particular weight of a truth that was going to cost someone something enormous. The money feeding Belandi's hidden operation came from inside Taejun's organization, not from a low-level account, from a management-level account, from someone inside the inner structure who had been, for at least 19 months, bleeding information and resources to the door to the command center opened at 6:52 a.m., and it wasn't Suhan who came through it. It was Taejun. He came in alone, which was unusual. In the 8 days she'd been on the property, she had never seen him move through the interior of the estate without at least one member of his detail within arm's reach. He closed the door behind him. He stood inside the threshold for a moment, and she registered in that moment something she hadn't seen on him before. The particular stillness of a man who had just been hit and was deciding whether the ground was still under him. His face was composed. Everything else was wrong. You saw the trace results, she said. Suhan brought them to me 20 minutes ago. He walked to the station beside hers and sat down, not at the keyboard, just in the chair, with his hands resting on his thighs. He looked at her screen. Show me how you found it. She walked him through it. The ratio discrepancy, the 19-month window, the consistent percentage that ruled out error and ruled in intention, the origin trace through 3 intermediate routing points that all resolved, eventually, to internal account reference 7 Kang. He listened without interrupting. His eyes were on the screen and she could not read them. The account designation, she said. 7 Kang. The Kang is a family identifier, he said. We use it for accounts that are in the direct management of family members rather than operational staff. His voice was flat, controlled, the kind of controlled that was very close to not controlled at all. There are 4 accounts with that designation. Mine, my mother's estate account, a charitable trust. He stopped. She waited. "And my brother's operational fund," he said. The command center was very quiet. The servers hummed at a frequency she felt in her back teeth. "Min Seo," she said. "Kang Min Seo?" "Yes." He looked at the screen. "My second in command, my brother, 34 years old." A pause. "He has been with me since the beginning of all of this. Since I was 22 and building something out of nothing, and he was 19 and the only person in my life I trusted completely." He stopped. He breathed once, slowly. "Show me the volume." She pulled up the aggregated transfer log. She had been precise about this. She always was, but this time she'd been precise the way a surgeon was precise with a scalpel, because she had understood from the moment the trace resolved that whoever received this information would need the numbers to be unimpeachable. No room for alternative explanations, no gaps where doubt could live. The numbers filled the screen. 19 months of transfers. Small amounts routed through the secondary layer into Belandi's hidden accounts. Intelligence payments, she believed, not cash for its own sake, but payments for information delivered. Strategic intelligence about Taejun's operations, his client relationships, his personnel vulnerabilities. The amount of money was secondary to what it represented. Someone had been selling Taejun's organization to his primary enemy for a year and a half, and the money trail led directly to his brother. Taejun looked at the screen for a long time without speaking. She watched him the way she watched a structural analysis she'd just completed, waiting for the load to be applied, waiting to see where the stress concentrated. "Is there any scenario," he said very quietly, "in which this trace is wrong?" She had run that question through her head 17 times in the past 40 minutes. She had wanted the answer to be yes. She had looked for the yes with the same systematic attention she brought to everything, and she had not found it. "No," she said. He nodded, once. Small movement. He stood up. He put his hands in his pockets. He looked at the door. "Don't share this with anyone else on the property," he said. "Not Suhan, not Jihye, no one." "Suhan already—" "I spoke to Suhan. He understands." He turned back to look at her. His eyes were the same as always, dark, still, the eyes of someone who processed at depth. But there was something behind them now that hadn't been there yesterday. Something that looked like grief working very hard to stay behind a wall. "I need a few hours." "Take what you need," she said. He left. She sat at the station and looked at the numbers on the screen and thought about what it cost to build something over 12 years with the person you trusted most, and then find out the architecture of that trust, the actual structural truth of it, in a 6-line transfer log on a Tuesday morning. She thought about that for a long time. Then she kept working, because there was more to find and she knew it, and the finding was the only thing she could offer that had any value at all. What she found, in the 4 hours after Taejun left, was worse. Min Seo hadn't only been selling intelligence. She found the second layer at 9:30 a.m. buried in a communications metadata trail she'd been granted access to as part of the broader network analysis. Encrypted signal routing that she couldn't decode but could map, could trace by origin point and destination even without the content. The pattern showed a direct communication channel established between a device registered to Min Seo's operational team and a server cluster in New Jersey that she'd already identified in the Belandi network mapping as Belandi's primary command communications hub. Regular contact, twice weekly, minimum, for 14 months. He wasn't just taking money for past intelligence. He was in active, ongoing communication with Marco Belandi. She sat with that. She let it land completely before she let herself calculate what it meant, because she had learned the hard way that running calculations before you'd fully received the data produced errors, and she could not afford errors right now. It meant that everything Taejun's organization had done in the past 14 months, every strategic decision, every operational move, every security protocol update, had potentially been communicated to Belandi within days of being made. It meant the losses Taejun had been experiencing weren't bad luck or Belandi's superior resources. They were the direct product of a man inside the room telling the enemy exactly what the room had decided. It meant that the estate's security, its location, its layout, its personnel, was potentially known. She printed the communications map. She took the stairs instead of the elevator. She moved faster than she had moved in the 8 days she'd been in this building. But Taejun was in the study with Suhan when she pushed the door open without knocking. Both men looked at her. Suhan's expression compressed toward objection. She crossed the room and put the communications map on the table in front of Taijun without preamble. "He's not just a source," she said. "He's an active channel. 14 months of direct contact with Belandi's command hub, twice weekly." She watched Taijun read the map. She watched him understand it. "The estate," she said. "He knows where we are." Taijun stood up so fast the chair moved. He looked at Suhan. "Get eyes on Min-seo," he said. "Now." Suhan was already moving, phone to his ear, out the door in 4 seconds. Taijun looked at the map on the table. He looked at it the way people looked at car accidents. The particular involuntary stillness of a brain refusing to fully process the scale of something. "How current is this?" he said. "Most recent contact I can place is 6 days ago," she said, "before I arrived." "So he knows you're here." The thought landed in her sternum like a fist. She'd been thinking about what Min-seo's access meant for Taejun's operations. She hadn't fully traced it to herself. "He knows someone new arrived," she said. "Whether he knows who I am." Her phone buzzed on the table where she'd set it down. Unknown number. She looked at Taejun. He nodded. She answered. The voice on the other end was male, unhurried, with the particular ease of someone making a call they'd been looking forward to. "Ms. Brooks, I was wondering how long it would take you to find the second layer." She kept her face still. Taejun was watching her with absolute concentration. "You have the wrong number," she said. "No, I have exactly the right number," the voice said. "I had your phone flagged when you left Caldwell's office on Wednesday. Took a while to crack the new SIM, but you changed it in the hotel. That was clever, but we managed." A pause. "My name is Anton Vance. I believe Taejun mentioned me." Her jaw tightened. Taejun saw it. He was reading her face the way she read spreadsheets. "What do you want?" she said. "The drive," Vance said. "The one you copied in the office Tuesday night. The complete Meridian Capital Solutions file. You bring it to me, I make the current situation considerably less dangerous for you. And if I don't, then you're collateral in a conflict you don't have any business being in." His voice was very calm, conversational. The calmness of someone who had made this kind of call many times and found it neither exciting nor difficult. "You're an accountant, Ms. Brooks. A good one, apparently. You found something you weren't supposed to find, and then you made a series of decisions that put you in a location with people who are about to have very serious problems. You don't have to share those problems." "I'll think about it," she said. "You have until tonight," Vance said. "After tonight, the offer expires and the situation becomes binary." The call ended. She set the phone down. Taejun hadn't moved. "Vance?" she said. "What did he offer?" "The drive I took from the office. He wants it. He's been looking for it since Tuesday." Taejun's voice was clipped, focused, the tactical register she recognized as what replaced everything else when he shifted into operational mode. Caldwell kept copies of the Meridian structure as insurance, things that documented Vance's involvement as much as Caldwell's own. When Caldwell died, Vance needed to make sure those copies disappeared. He looked at her. "You took the only copy he doesn't have. So he needs me to hand it over. Or he eliminates you and retrieves the drive from wherever you've been keeping it." He looked at her bag on the chair by the door. "Where is it?" She met his eyes. "On me." He looked at her for a moment, not with suspicion, with something closer to recognition, the assessment of a person who understood why you didn't fully trust the room you were in. "Good," he said. Suhan came back through the door. His face was a controlled emergency. "Min-seo is not in his quarters," he said. "He's not in any of the buildings. His car is in the garage. His phone is in his room." He looked at Taejun. "He made one call from a landline in the East Wing 40 minutes ago. We're tracing the number now." 40 minutes ago was when Taejun had left the command center, when Min-seo would have seen his brother's face after whatever conversation Taejun had needed a few hours to absorb. He'd known, Nyla thought. Min-seo had seen it in Taejun's face, and he'd known that it was over, and he'd made one call and disappeared. "He's in the building," Taejun said, certainty in his voice. Not hope. Knowledge. "He wouldn't leave without—" He stopped. He looked at Nyla, and something shifted in his expression that she'd never seen there before. urgency with an edge of something raw underneath. He wouldn't leave without completing whatever Belandi sent him here to do. The three of them looked at each other. The command center, Nyla said. They moved fast and they moved wrong. She understood that later, that the three of them moving together down the interior stairs toward the command center was exactly what Minseo had been positioned to expect, because Minseo had been in every security protocol meeting for the past 14 months, and he knew how Tae-jun responded to internal threats, knew the sequence, knew the timeline. The command center door was closed. Suhan reached it first. He pushed it open. The server room was dark. The stations were dark. Everything had been cut, power to the workstations, the network connections, the data archive system that contained 4 months of Belandi intelligence work and her own 8 days of mapping. Standing in the middle of the dark room, lit only by the emergency lighting strips at floor level, was Kang Min-seo. She had seen him at a distance twice in 8 days. In the main hall, moving through the back of the property. She hadn't looked closely because he wasn't part of what she'd been working on, and she'd been working with her head down. She looked closely now. He was younger than Tae-jun by enough to be visible, a face that still had softness around the edges that Tae-jun's had long since shed. He had the same jaw, the same stillness in the eyes, but where Tae-jun's stillness was the product of control, Min-seo's looked like something else, like a decision that had already been made, like the calm that lived on the other side of a long internal argument that had finally been resolved. He was holding a gun. It was pointed at Nyla, not at Tae-jun, not at Suhan, at her. She understood the logic of it immediately, with the cold clarity of her brain performing under pressure. She was the newest variable. She was the one who had found the trace. She was the one whose removal was cleanest in terms of what it would cost Belandi's operation going forward. And she was the one whose death would send Tae-jun a specific message, that Min-seo had been willing to eliminate a civilian, which meant the line he was willing to cross had moved considerably. "Close the door," Min-seo said. His voice was steady. It had the quality of someone who had rehearsed this or something close to it. He was looking at Tae-jun, not at her, even though the gun was pointed at her. "Close the door, Hyung. Let's talk." Tae-jun stepped into the room. Suhan moved to follow. Min-seo's gun hand adjusted. A single degree of arc. A small adjustment, very controlled. "Just you," Min-seo said. "And her." Tae-jun looked at Suhan. A communication she couldn't fully read passed between them. Quick, practiced, the shorthand of years. Suhan stayed outside. The door closed. 3 of them in the dark room. Emergency lighting at the floor. The gun between them like a fact that hadn't been fully spoken yet. Tae-jun looked at his brother with the expression of a man looking at something that was irreversible. "Put it down," he said. Quiet. Not begging. Not commanding. Something in between that was worse than either. "I can't," Min-seo said. "Min-seo, you already know." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, the only crack in the surface. "I saw your face when you came out of your study. I've known your face my whole life. You already know everything." "Yes," Tae-jun said. "Then you know I can't put it down." Nyla kept her eyes on the gun. She was aware of the distance between herself and Min-seo, 8 feet. She was aware of the distance between herself and the door, 12. She was doing what she always did when she was afraid, building the map of the situation, cataloging the variables, looking for the equation that produced a survivable outcome. She had not found it yet. "Why?" Tae-jun asked. One word. The weight of 12 years in it. Min-seo's jaw tightened. "Because you were never going to stop. You built this. You built all of this, and it just kept getting bigger, and I kept being the person standing slightly behind you holding the thing you just put down. For 12 years. His voice was controlled again, tight. "Belandi offered me a way to have something that was mine. He offered you a way to destroy what was ours." "It was never ours," Min-seo said. "It was always yours. I was furniture." The silence in the room was the silence of something breaking that was too large to make a sound. Tae-jun took 1 step toward his brother. Min-seo's gun arm straightened. "Don't," Min-seo said. "I'm not going to take the gun," Tae-jun said. He stopped. He looked at his brother across the 8 feet of dark between them. I'm going to ask you something, and I need the truth, because it's the last time I can ask you for it. A beat. Did you know they were going to kill Caldwell? Mincio said nothing. Did you give them his location? The silence was its own answer. Taejun's face did something she couldn't fully name. A small interior collapse. Like a wall coming down in a building and the rest of the structure standing but changed. Different load-bearing now, rearranged. You gave Vance everything he needed to clean up Caldwell, Taejun said quietly. And when she walked out of that office with what she knew, he stopped. He looked at Nyla. He looked back at Mincio. You gave him her too. Mincio's eyes moved to her for the first time. She held them. She did not look away. She had learned in the past 8 days that looking away from the truth was the thing she was least capable of, and she wasn't going to learn now. Vance wants the drive, Mincio said. Give it to him. She walks. This ends. It doesn't end, Taejun said. You know it doesn't end. The moment she hands him the drive, that's not your problem. I'm making it my problem. Mincio's eyes went back to his brother, and in them Nyla saw the thing she'd been watching for. The hairline fracture in the decision that had already been made. The place where the rehearsed version of this conversation diverged from the actual version because the actual version contained Taejun's face and 12 years and the irreducible human fact of having grown up alongside someone. She took one step to her left. Small, slow, moving her body out of the direct line. Mincio's gun tracked her. Don't, he said. I'm not doing anything, she said. First words she'd spoken since they'd entered the room. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. I'm just... The door exploded inward. Not opened. Exploded. The reinforced door coming off the upper hinge and swinging wide under the impact of a shoulder hit from the exterior. And Suhan was through it with 2 members of the security detail behind him, and the room reorganized itself in approximately 1 second into something entirely different. Mincio spun toward the door. Taejun moved. She would reconstruct it later in the precise sequential order of things she'd registered, but in the moment it was a single compressed fact. Taejun crossing the distance to his brother in 2 steps, his hand closing over Mincio's gun arm, and Mincio twisting, and the gun discharging once into the ceiling. A sound that was enormous in the enclosed space. A sound that reorganized her entire nervous system in half a second. A sound that she felt in her ears and her chest and the backs of her hands. The security detail had Mincio on the floor in the next 4 seconds. The gun was on the floor. Taejun was standing with his back to her, both hands at his sides, breathing. She could see it, the movement of his shoulders, the controlled rhythm of a man pulling himself back from an edge. Mincio was face down on the floor with a knee on his back, his cheek against the cold concrete, looking up at his brother with an expression that she did not want to describe because it was too much. Too much of something that had no clean name. The expression of a person who had gone all the way to the edge of a thing and found on the other side of it not relief, but only the specific devastation of having been wrong about what they'd find there. Young, Mincio said. The word was very quiet. Taejun looked down at his brother. He said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was the flattest she'd ever heard it. Not cold, emptied. Get him out of here, he said. They took Mincio out. The room was still. The server banks were still dark. Somewhere above them, through the concrete and the floors, the estate was still running, staff moving, the property perimeter being maintained, the ordinary infrastructure of a secure location proceeding without knowledge of what had just happened 40 feet underground. Taejun stood in the middle of the dark room for a very long time. Then he turned. He looked at her. His eyes were the eyes of someone who had just paid a price they'd known was coming and had not been able to fully prepare for regardless. Are you hurt? He said. No, she said. He nodded. She looked at the dark server banks. She looked at the cut network connections. She looked at the door hanging off its hinge and the gun on the floor and the absence in the room where Mincio had been. The data archive, she said. If he wiped it, I know. Everything we built. The Belandi map. The communications trace. The financial... I know, Nyla. She stopped. She breathed. She was shaking. She registered it now that the immediate thing was over. The fine tremor in her hands that was her body's delayed invoice for the last 10 minutes. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs. "We still have what I haven't uploaded yet," she said. "My personal trace methodology, the Eastern Europe account structures, the secondary operation map." She looked at him. "It's not everything, but it's enough to rebuild from." He looked at her. "The drive," he said quietly. She reached into her jacket. The drive was there, warm from her body heat, small and dense and containing everything she'd copied on a Tuesday night that had started all of this. She held it. She thought about Vance's call, the offer expiring tonight, the binary situation that came after. She thought about Minsio's face on the floor. She thought about the estate's coordinates in Belandi's system and the communications channel that had been running twice weekly for 14 months, and the fact that somewhere in New Jersey, a server cluster had just gone quiet because the man on this end of the channel was currently face down on a concrete floor with a security detail standing over him. And somewhere on the other end of that channel, Marco Belandi was going to notice the silence. She looked at Tae-jun. "He's going to move," she said. "Belandi. When he can't reach Minseo, he's going to assume the channel is blown and he's going to move before you can regroup. He'll hit the estate." Tae-jun's jaw set. "How long do we have?" he said. She thought about response timelines, about military-style operational planning, about the communications gap and what a man with Belandi's resources would do when his inside source went dark without warning. "Hours," she said, "not days." Tae-jun looked at the ruined room. He looked at the gun on the floor. He looked at her, at the drive in her hand and the shaking she wasn't quite managing to suppress, and the face of a woman who had walked into this building 8 days ago as a forensic accountant and was standing in a dark command center at the beginning. The first thing Tae-jun did was pull every person on the property into the main hall. 14 people. Security detail, analysts, 2 staff members who managed the estate's operations. He stood at the front of the room and he spoke for 3 minutes in a voice that did not rise or drop and contained in its flatness more authority than shouting would have. Nyla stood at the back and watched the room receive the information, the breach, Minseo, the likely incoming assault, and she watched the way that information moved through 14 different faces and produced, in all of them, the same result. Not panic, tightening. The particular compression of people who had trained for this and were now discovering that training was about to become the only thing standing between them and something real. She noticed in the back of her mind that none of them looked at her with blame. She'd half expected it. She was the one who'd found the trace. She was the reason Minseo had been cornered this morning. She was the new variable in a situation that had previously been contained. But the room didn't look at her that way, and she filed that information somewhere she'd deal with later, when there was a later. Tae-jun finished speaking. The room dispersed in under 30 seconds, each person moving with the purposefulness of someone who had an assigned task and was executing it. Suhan stayed behind, along with Ji-hye and 2 of the senior security detail, whose names Nyla had learned in the past 8 days. Park and Choi. Late 30s, the kind of quiet competence that didn't need to announce itself. "Perimeter first," Tae-jun said. "Choi, I want the approach roads covered from the tree line, both sides, 300 meters out. If anything moves on those roads in the next 4 hours that isn't ours, I want to know 30 seconds before it arrives." "Done," Choi said. He left. "Park, the dock and the lake approach. If Belandi's using water, he'll come from the East Cove. Position 2 there." Park left. Tae-jun looked at Suhan. "The server room. How much can we restore?" "The archive is gone," Suhan said. His voice was tight, controlled. He'd had 20 minutes to absorb Minseo's betrayal, and he was working with what he had. Minseo used a wipe protocol on the main drives, but the backup partition, the one I moved to the secondary server 6 days ago, he didn't know about it. It's intact. "How much is on it?" "About 60% of the Belandi financial map, not the communications trace, not the Eastern Europe account structures." They both looked at Nyla. She held up the drive. "Everything I haven't uploaded yet is on this," she said. "The Eastern Europe accounts, the secondary operation map, the communications routing metadata." She paused. "If I can get back into the command center and restore the network connection, I can finish what I was building. The complete picture of Belandi's financial architecture." "The network connection is cut at the junction box," Suhan said. "Where's the junction box?" "East corridor sub-basement." Then that's where I need to go first. Taejun looked at her. He looked at the drive. He looked back at her face. Ji-hye goes with you, he said. Not a question. Fine, she said. Nyla. He said her name the way he always said it, direct, without decoration, as if the word itself required no adjustment. Whatever you're building down there, I need it operational within 2 hours. After that, it won't matter what we know. It'll only matter what we can survive. She held his gaze. I'll be done in 90 minutes. The junction box was in a utility corridor that smelled like concrete dust and standing water, lit by a single fluorescent strip that flickered on the left side with the particular rhythm of something that had been failing for months and hadn't quite finished the job. Ji-hye held a flashlight on the panel while Nyla worked, and Nyla worked with her hands moving faster than her thoughts, which was a state she'd discovered in herself only recently. The capacity to let her hands do the technical work while her brain ran parallel calculations about things that weren't the technical work. She was thinking about the timeline, about what Belandi would do when the silence from Minseo's channel extended from 1 hour to 2 to 4, about whether he'd already been preparing the assault, pre-positioning assets, moving personnel, and was just waiting for the signal that Minseo would never send. She was thinking about Anton Vance and the offer that had expired at some point in the last 3 hours. She was thinking about what the binary situation looked like from Vance's end. And she was thinking about whether Vance and Belandi were coordinating or operating in parallel. And she was thinking that it didn't actually matter because either way, the result was the same. She got the network connection restored in 22 minutes. Ji-hye looked at her. You good? Ji-hye said. Ask me in 90 minutes, Nyla said. The command center was cold. Someone had cut the climate control along with the power and it hadn't fully come back up. She worked in her jacket, her fingers stiff for the first 10 minutes, until the workstation's heat spread across the desk surface and she stopped noticing. The drive loaded. The files came up. She started building. She worked the way she always worked when it was real. No music, no background noise, just the actual texture of the data and the map taking shape beneath her hands. She pulled the Eastern Europe account structures first, rebuilt the primary layer of the Belandi financial architecture, on top of Suhan's restored 60%, filled the gaps with her own sourcing methodology until the map was whole. Then she went deeper. She wasn't just mapping anymore. She was looking for the thing she'd been constructing toward for 8 days without fully naming, the exploit. The point in Belandi's financial architecture where the structure was load-bearing enough that if you pulled it, everything above it came down. Every financial empire had one. It was the thing the builders always failed to see because they were too close to it, too certain of their own engineering. The most critical node was always disguised as something routine, something so fundamental to the system's function that it had been made invisible by ubiquity. She'd found it in the Meridian Capital Solutions structure on a Tuesday night without looking for it. She'd been finding them her whole career, in firms and portfolios and corporate accounts that were very certain of their own solidity. She found it in Belandi's network at the 50-minute mark. It was the Eastern Europe routing infrastructure. Specifically, 3 financial institutions in Bratislava and Warsaw that processed the majority of Belandi's interorganizational transfers. Those 3 institutions were the circulatory system of the empire. Every other account, every shell company, every legitimate front business depended on those 3 institutions for liquidity. If those institutions received a coordinated report to the relevant financial crime authorities, not an anonymous tip, but a formal, documented, evidence-based report with transaction logs, routing metadata, and the kind of specificity that triggered immediate institutional freeze orders rather than months-long investigations, Belandi's organization would lose access to its primary cash flow within hours, not permanently. Permanently required court orders and investigations that took years. But hours was enough. Hours was exactly what she needed. She looked at the clock. 11:47 a.m. She looked at the drive. She had the Meridian Capital Solutions documentation on that drive. The original evidence of a money laundering network that connected through 3 layers of shell structure to accounts she could now link directly to Belandi's Eastern Europe institutions. That documentation, combined with the transaction logs she'd built in the past 8 days, constituted the kind of evidence package that financial crime investigators dreamed about. Complete, sourced, cross-referenced, and unimpeachable. She pulled up the secure submission portals for the financial intelligence units of Slovakia, Poland, and the European Banking Authority. She started preparing the report. Thump. The first explosion happened at 1:23 p.m. She felt it before she heard it. A pressure change, the building absorbing an impact somewhere above and to the north, a shudder that ran through the concrete under her feet and up through the desk and into her hands on the keyboard. Then the sound, arriving late the way sound did through structure, a deep concussive thud that her body translated as danger before her brain had finished processing the input. The lights in the command center flickered, stayed on. Her workstation stayed up. She kept typing. Her phone buzzed. Tae-jun. They're here. Stay in the command center. Do not come up. She typed back. I need 25 more minutes. The response came in 4 seconds. You have 20, Tae-shu. Above her, she pieced together later the assault was coming from 3 vectors simultaneously. The North Approach Road, 2 armored vehicles, 6 men each, moving fast with the confidence of people who had reviewed a security map of the property, which they had because Min Seo had given it to them. They knew where the cameras were. They knew where the guards were positioned. They knew the layout of the main house down to the interior door placements. What they didn't know was that Tae-jun had spent the past 90 minutes repositioning every single element of his defense based on the assumption that everything Min Seo had given them was accurate, which meant every position they expected to find was a trap. The East Cove. 3 men in a boat that Park and his detail met at the dock with the advantage of having been waiting. That engagement lasted 7 minutes and ended in favor of the defense. The tree-line perimeter to the west. A 4-man team that Choi's people had been watching for 45 minutes before the assault began, tracking their approach, letting them get close enough that retreat was not a practical option before making contact. Tae-jun was in the middle of all of it, moving between positions, coordinating through an earpiece, making the kind of rapid sequential decisions that only came out right when you had spent enough years making them that the calculation had become partially instinctive. He took a fragment hit to the left arm from a vehicle-mounted weapon in the 2nd minute of the North engagement. She learned this later, not from him. And he wrapped it with a strip of jacket lining and kept moving. She was 50 feet underground typing at a keyboard, and the building shook around her 3 more times, and she kept typing. Well, the report was 94 pages when she submitted it. She submitted to Slovakia first, then Poland, then the EBA, using the secure institutional channels she'd accessed through her professional credentials. Credentials that still worked because no one had thought to revoke them, because no one at Caldwell and Pierce knew exactly what she'd done in the 8 days since she'd left the building. The submissions included the Complete Meridian Capital Solutions transaction logs, the Eastern Europe account routing metadata, the cross-referenced connection to Belandi's network, and a cover document that was the clearest, most precisely written thing she'd produced in her career, which was saying something. She hit submit on the EBA report at 1:51 p.m. She picked up her phone and called the number. It rang twice. Tell me you're not done, Tae-jun said. His voice was tight, slightly breathless. Background noise, wind, something mechanical, a voice calling out a position report somewhere behind him. I'm done, she said. The reports are submitted. Slovak FIU, Polish FIU, European Banking Authority. If their freeze protocols run standard, Belandi's Eastern Europe accounts should start locking within the hour. A pause. She heard him breathing. His funding, Tae-jun said. Goes dark, she said. Everything dependent on those institutions, payroll, logistics, the operational accounts for whatever he has deployed right now, it all freezes. He can't pay the people shooting at you. Another pause. Longer. How long before he finds a workaround? Days, minimum. Weeks if the investigation escalates the way it should with this evidence package. She looked at the submitted confirmation screens. He's not done permanently, but he's done today. She heard him say something she couldn't make out. Not to her, to someone nearby. Then a sound she couldn't categorize immediately, something sharp and final, and then relative quiet. Stay where you are, he said. I'll come to you. He didn't come to her for 31 minutes. She sat in the cold command center and watched the clock and listened to the building and tried to map what she was hearing against what she knew was happening. Gunfire diminishing, voices on radios, the machinery of a confrontation winding down from its peak toward its end. She drank the cold coffee that had been on the desk since morning. She looked at the completed financial map on her screen and thought about the $900 million she'd first found on a Tuesday night and how far that single discovery had traveled in 10 days. She thought about Gregory Caldwell in a headline. She thought about the gun in the dark command center. She thought about Tae-Jun's face when he'd said, "Get him out of here," and the 12 years that had lived in those 4 words. She thought about her apartment in the South Loop with the broken blinds she'd been meaning to replace, which felt very far away and very small and very much like a life that no longer quite fit the shape she'd become. The door opened at 2:22 p.m. Tae-Jun came in first, and she had approximately 3 seconds to absorb how he looked before she disciplined her face into something neutral. His jacket was gone. His shirt was torn at the left shoulder, and below the tear was a wound wrapping that was improvised and dark at the edges. His face had the particular quality of someone who had been running on pure operational fuel for hours and was only now allowing the system to register the cost. He was still standing straight. His eyes, when they found her across the room, had the same quality they always had: direct, immediate, reading the actual thing. Soo-han came in behind him. Ji-hae. Park, with a cut above his eyebrow that had been roughly taped. 2 others she didn't know by name. Everyone was present. Everyone was standing. She felt something in her chest release, a tension she'd been holding for 91 minutes without fully acknowledging it. Tae-Jun walked to her workstation. He looked at the screen. He looked at the submission confirmation receipt still open in the browser windows. "It's done," she said. "Yes," he said. He looked at her. "You're okay." It wasn't quite a question. She answered it anyway. "I'm okay," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was almost not an expression. The near face of a man who was allowing himself 1 second of something he didn't usually permit in operational contexts. Something that was neither relief nor gratitude exactly, but contained both of them somewhere in its architecture. Then Soo-han spoke from the doorway. "Belandi's vehicles are withdrawing on the North Road," Choi confirmed. "They're pulling back." Tae-Jun didn't look away from the screen. "The accounts?" Soo-han checked his phone. He looked up with an expression she'd never seen on him. Not quite shock, but the version of shock that lives in a person who has been told to expect something and still isn't prepared for it when it arrives. "Slovak FIU issued an emergency freeze order 11 minutes ago," Soo-han said. 14 accounts. The notification just came through on the monitoring feed. He looked at Nyla. "It's moving." She looked at the screen. She thought about the moment on a Tuesday night when she'd been alone at her desk with a cold cup of hot chocolate and a number that didn't add up, and about the particular stubbornness that had made her pull the thread anyway instead of letting it go, and about everything that had unraveled from that single pulled thread in 10 days. "It'll cascade," she said. "Once Slovakia moves, Poland moves. Once Poland moves, the EBA flags everything connected. Belandi's people on the ground are going to start seeing frozen accounts within the hour. They'll pull back because they won't have a choice. You can't run an operation when you can't pay for it." Tae-Jun looked at her. "I know," he said. "He's not done," she said. "He'll rebuild. It'll take time and it'll cost him, but he'll find another structure." "Yes, ma," Tae-Jun said. "But he won't be rebuilding the same way, not with the same architecture, not with any of the accounts or institutions on record in what you submitted." He paused. "He'll start over. And starting over costs more than money. It costs relationships, trust, time." He looked at the screen. By the time he has rebuilt to the point where he can threaten this organization again, the situation will be different. "Different how?" He looked at her. "Because we won't have the same vulnerabilities we had today." She understood what he meant. Minseo, the inside channel, the 14 months of compromised intelligence, the door that had let Belandi see everything. It was closed now, whatever the cost of closing it. She looked at Tae-Jun's wrapped arm. "You need that looked at." "I know." "Then why are you still standing here?" Something moved across his face that was almost under different circumstances, almost something she'd call the beginning of a smile. "Because the woman who just dismantled a criminal empire's financial infrastructure from a basement is telling me to go get a bandage, and I find I am inclined to do what she says." "Good instinct," she said. He straightened. He looked at the room, at Soo-han, at Jihye, at Park and the others. He looked at the restored command center and the completed map on the screen and the submitted reports that were already triggering freeze orders in Eastern European financial institutions. He looked at Nyla last and longest. Outside, above them, the sound of the assault had gone entirely quiet. The lake was probably very still. The smoke from the north approach was probably drifting across the property in the October cold, dissipating into the gray sky over Lake Geneva. The battle had stopped. The war, the financial one, the one that actually decided the outcome, was still moving, cascade by cascade, through 17 accounts in 3 countries, and the freeze orders moved through the system the way she'd predicted. Cascade by cascade, institution by institution, each triggered freeze pulling the next one down like dominoes laid in a pattern that only made sense when you could see the whole floor. She watched it happen in real time from the command center, the confirmation notifications arriving in the secure monitoring feed that Su Han had restored to the secondary server. Slovakia at 2:09 p.m. Poland at 2:31 p.m. The European Banking Authority's coordinating order at 3:14 p.m., which triggered automatic notification to 7 additional member state financial intelligence units who had correspondent relationships with the flagged institutions. By 4 p.m., 42 accounts across 9 countries had been frozen pending investigation. 42 accounts. She'd found the first thread on a Tuesday night with a cold cup of hot chocolate and a number that didn't add up. That thread had pulled, and what had unraveled at the end of it was this: an empire's financial foundation, cracking along fault lines that had always been there and just needed someone stubborn enough to keep looking until she found them. She sat in the cold command center alone. Taejun had gone upstairs to have his arm treated, the others dispersing to manage the property's aftermath. And she watched the notifications arrive, and she let herself feel the weight of it. Not triumph, something heavier than triumph and more honest. The particular exhaustion of a person who had been running on emergency fuel for 10 days and was only now, in the quiet, being allowed to notice the cost. Her hands were steady now. They'd stopped shaking somewhere in the middle of the second hour of the assault when she'd passed through fear and come out the other side into something else. A place below panic where things were simply very clear, and the next step was always visible even if nothing beyond it was. She looked at the drive on the desk beside the keyboard. She picked it up, turned it over in her fingers. She thought about what it had cost. Gregory Caldwell, who had been a terrible person but had not deserved what happened to him at a construction site on Wednesday afternoon. The 2 members of Taejun's security detail who had been injured in the assault, one seriously, she'd heard, though she didn't know details yet. Min Seo, face down on a concrete floor, saying Hyung in a voice that contained 12 years of something that had gone completely wrong. And Taejun, standing in the middle of all of it, paying price after price after price, with the particular silence of a man who had decided long ago that the bill would always be his to settle. She set the drive down. She went upstairs. The main floor of the estate had the texture of aftermath, the specific quality of a space that had been through something and was now in the process of becoming itself again. 2 members of the security detail were replacing a section of window frame in the east sitting room that had taken damage. Someone had swept the broken glass from the hallway. The smell of smoke was fading in the cold air coming through a propped-open door. Jihee was in the kitchen, moving with the efficient calm of someone who managed crisis as a professional function rather than an emotional one. She looked up when Nyla came in. "Sit," Jihee said. "There's food. Actual food, not whatever you've been surviving on down there." Nyla sat at the kitchen island. Jihee put a bowl of rice and something hot in front of her without ceremony, and Nyla ate it without ceremony. And for a few minutes neither of them spoke, and the kitchen held only the sounds of ordinary things. Spoon on ceramic, the quiet simmer of something on the stove, the distant sound of the lake against the shore. "How's the man who was hurt?" Nyla asked. "The one they said was serious." "Resting," Jihee said. "He'll keep the leg. The doctor was here by 3. Nyla absorbed this. "And Taejun's arm?" 7 stitches. Jihee set a glass of water beside the bowl. He sat through it without making a sound and then asked the doctor to leave so he could make calls. A pause. "He does not take injury well." "Does he take anything that isn't work well?" Jihi considered this for a moment, with the careful honesty of someone who chose their words precisely. He takes loyalty well, she said, and competence. Those are the things that matter to him. She looked at Nyla. You gave him both. Nyla looked at the bowl. I gave him a financial report and a crisis, she said. You gave him the truth, Jiha said. In this kind of work, those are the same thing. She picked up a cloth and turned back to the counter. He wants to see you when you've eaten. His study, Barshek. The study was lit differently at this hour. The afternoon had gone gray outside the windows, the lake flat and pewter-colored, and someone had turned on the lamp on the desk that cast a warmer, smaller light over the room's interior. Taejun was at the desk when she came in. His left arm was in a clean bandage, the sleeve rolled above it. He was looking at something on his phone, but he put it down when she appeared in the doorway. She came in. She sat in the chair across the desk from him, the visitor's chair, the same side of the desk she'd always been on. They looked at each other. Anton Vance, she said. He nodded. He was taken into custody by federal agents this morning, before the assault. She blinked. Before the drive, he said. The Meridian Capital Solutions documentation you copied. I contacted a federal financial crimes investigator I have a relationship with on Tuesday evening, before I sent the car for you. The documentation you provided via secure channel was sufficient to obtain an arrest warrant. He paused. Vance was detained at O'Hare at 10:15 a.m. He was attempting to board a flight to the Cayman Islands. She sat with this. You moved on Vance before the assault started. Yes. You didn't tell me. No. His jaw shifted slightly. I was not certain the arrest would hold. Federal matters are unpredictable. I didn't want you carrying that information until it was confirmed. He looked at her steadily. It was confirmed at 11 this morning. I intended to tell you. Then the command center happened, and after that things moved quickly, she said. Yes. She looked at the window. Outside, the lake was going dark at its edges, the far shore disappearing into early evening. She thought about Vance on a plane to the Cayman Islands that he never boarded, and she thought about the binary situation he'd described on the phone, the offer expiring, the situation becoming binary. And she thought about the particular satisfaction of a binary situation that resolved in a direction Vance hadn't anticipated. What happens now, she said, with the investigation, with the Meridian documentation? The federal case will move forward. Caldwell is gone, but the documentation implicates others, his associates, his clients who knew or should have known. The investigation will be long. He paused. Your name is part of the record. You'll be contacted, in time, as a material witness. I know, she said. I've been expecting that. The federal investigators understand the nature of how you came to have the documentation. Your cooperation, both in obtaining the evidence and in the submissions you made today to the European authorities, constitutes significant good faith. He held her eyes. You won't be prosecuted. She exhaled. She hadn't let herself fully consider that possibility, because considering it had required acknowledging how real it was, and she'd had enough to carry. The exhale was quiet, and she didn't perform it, and she thought he probably noticed it anyway. My job, she said. Gone, he said simply. Caldwell and Pierce Financial Partners will not survive the investigation. The firm will be dissolved within 6 months, I expect. She nodded. She'd known this too. She'd known it since Tuesday night, in the back of the place where she kept the calculation she wasn't ready to act on yet. Okay, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. She had the feeling, familiar now, after 10 days, of being actually read rather than merely observed, of someone looking at the thing itself rather than the surface of it. I want to offer you a position, he said. She waited. Not here, he said. Not in this. He gestured slightly at the room and what it represented. My organization has legitimate financial interests, substantial ones. Real estate, private equity, several operating companies in 4 countries. Those operations require a forensic accounting function that can withstand scrutiny from any direction. He paused. The person running that function would need to be exceptional. They would also need to be someone whose relationship to the truth was non-negotiable. She looked at him. You're offering me a real job, she said. I am offering you the job you should have had years ago, he said, with the compensation and authority that your capacity warrants. He held her gaze. I am not offering it because of what you did this week. I'm offering it because of what I understand about how you think. The week was evidence. The offer is based on the evidence. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a bird crossed the window's frame, a dark shape against the pewter sky. There and then gone. I need to think about it, she said. I know, he said. Take the time you need. A pause. There is no pressure in the answer. If you say no, I will ensure you have what you need to reestablish yourself. References, connections, compensation for the past 10 days and the risk you carried. The offer and the support are not contingent on each other. She looked at him. That's, she said, a very clean offer. I've had it prepared since the third day you were here, he said. She blinked. The third day. You found Belandi's actual architecture on the second day. On the third day, you corrected a compounded error in Suhan's model in 45 seconds while explaining your reasoning to a man who was actively hoping you were wrong. He paused. I decided on the third day. I waited until now to ask because asking sooner would have been inappropriate. She thought about the third day. She remembered it as a day she'd eaten lunch at her workstation and drunk too much coffee and argued with Suhan about a data set. She had not known she was being watched. She was always being watched. She'd spent her career being watched and evaluated and found wanting. This was the first time she was discovering retroactively that she'd been watched and found sufficient. More than sufficient. She looked at her hands on the arms of the chair. I'll give you an answer by the end of the week, she said. That's fine, he said. She found Suhan in the command center at 7 that evening. He was alone, working at his station, the restored systems running the ongoing cascade monitoring. He heard her come in and looked up. His face did the thing it did, the careful, controlled assessment. She sat at her station. She pulled up the monitoring feed. They worked in silence for a while. The silence had a different quality than it had 2 days ago. Less temperature in it. Not warm, not yet, but not the active cold of before. The Slovak freeze held, he said, without looking up from his screen. I saw, she said. The Polish escalation is cleaner than I expected. Their FIU moved faster. They had a case pending against one of the flagged institutions already, Suhan said. Your submission gave them the additional predicate they needed to accelerate. A pause. It was good work. She looked at the side of his face. He was still looking at his screen. Thank you, she said. He nodded. One movement, returned to his data. She returned to hers. At 8:30, without looking up from the monitoring feed, Suhan said, the secondary operation, the one you identified in the ratio discrepancy. The origin trace resolved completely this afternoon. The operator of that account was not someone in Belandi's network. She looked at him. Who was it? One of Belandi's own financial managers, running a side operation Belandi didn't know about, using the infrastructure exactly the way you described, a house with a secret door. He paused. When Belandi's accounts froze today, that manager was left exposed. He made contact with a federal financial crimes office in New Jersey at 4 this afternoon. He's cooperating. She absorbed this. He's giving up Belandi, completely, in exchange for consideration. Suhan looked at her. The fracture point you identified, you said it was leverage. I said it might be, she said. It was, he said. The federal case against Belandi is now considerably stronger than it was this morning, primarily because you noticed a ratio discrepancy in a 19-month data window. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who was revising an assessment and was precise enough to acknowledge the revision. I would not have found that. She held his gaze. You would have, she said. Eventually. Perhaps, he said. Eventually. A pause. But not in time. She looked at her screen. For what it's worth, she said, your original model was the foundation. Without the 60% you'd built, I couldn't have completed it as fast as I did. The architecture was right. The single wrong assumption was fundamental, he said. A wrong assumption in the foundation propagates through everything above it. He paused. I know how structural error works. I built the wrong structure and you corrected it. Both of those things are true. He returned to his screen. I would rather know both things than only one. She thought that was probably the most honest thing she'd heard anyone say in 10 days. She went back to work. She walked to the lake at 10 p.m. The dock was cold under her shoes, the planking still damp from the morning's weather, the lake moving in small, quiet repetitions against the pilings. The moon was fuller tonight than it had been the first time she'd come out here, the water catching it in broken shapes that reassembled and broke again with each small wave. She could see the far shore as a dark line. The sky above it was very clear and very full, the way skies got away from cities, the way she'd forgotten skies looked. She heard him before she saw him, the particular sound of his footsteps on the dock, which she'd come to recognize the way she recognized the pattern in a data set that recurred often enough to become identifiable. He came to the end of the dock. He stood beside her, the same few feet of distance as the first time, the same orientation toward the water. For a while, neither of them spoke. "Min-seo," she said. "He's being held," Tai-jun said, "at a secure location. Not here." A pause. "I'm still deciding what comes next for him. That must be—" She stopped. "Hard," he said, completing it. "Yes." His voice was even, not empty. She could hear what was underneath it, had learned to hear that over 10 days, the register beneath the control. "He was 19 years old when I brought him in. I thought I was giving him something. I thought I was giving him—" He stopped. He looked at the water. "I don't know what I was giving him. I know what he experienced it as." She thought about Min-seo's voice in the dark command center. "It was always yours. I was furniture." "He wasn't wrong that you overshadowed him," she said. She said it carefully, not to wound, because she'd decided in the past 2 hours that the most useful thing she could offer was the same thing she always offered, the truth in its actual shape. "He was wrong about what he did with that, but the feeling underneath it, that's not invented." Tai-jun was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said, "it's not." The water moved. The moon's reflection broke and reassembled. "I spent 2 years at Caldwell and Pierce being told I was inadequate," she said, "being managed into smaller and smaller spaces. And I stayed because I thought if I just kept doing the work, eventually the work would be enough." She paused. Min-seo stayed too. He just made a different choice about what to do when it wasn't enough. "He made a choice that got people killed," Tai-jun said. His voice was quiet, not dismissive, precise. "Yes," she said. "He did. I'm not absolving the choice. I'm saying I understand what it feels like to be invisible in someone else's success and have to decide what to do with that." She looked at the water. "I chose to keep pulling threads at midnight. He chose something else." Tai-jun looked at her. She could feel it without turning her head. The quality of his attention, that particular full presence regard that she'd spent 10 days being subject to and had never fully gotten accustomed to. "What made you pull the thread?" he said. "That night, you could have filed the surface report and gone home." She thought about this. She'd thought about it before. In the hotel room. In the dark hours when she'd been trying to understand her own choices. She hadn't found a clean answer. She found the honest one instead. "I couldn't not," she said. "I saw something that wasn't right, and I couldn't make myself look away from it. I never could." She paused. "It's not particularly a virtue. It's just the way I'm built. It's gotten me in trouble my whole career, actually, seeing things people didn't want seen." "It is absolutely a virtue," he said quietly. She looked at him then, at his profile against the dark water and the moon-broken surface and the far shore, at the jaw and the stillness and the thing underneath the stillness that she'd learned over 10 days to read as something real rather than performed. "You should know," she said, "that I'm going to take the position." He looked at her. "I decided while I was eating Jihye's rice," she said. "I've been sitting with it for 3 hours to make sure it was a decision and not just—" She gestured slightly. "Proximity, adrenaline, the particular bond that forms between people who've been in a crisis together and mistake it for something structural. And it's not those things. It might be those things too," she said, "but it's also, I have never, in my professional life, been in a room where my work was treated as the thing that actually mattered, where what I found and how I found it was the point, rather than how I looked finding it, or whether I made people comfortable while I did it. She looked at the water. Your command center is the first place I've worked in my career where I felt sized correctly, like the space was built for the capacity rather than the other way around. She paused. That's worth something. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. He was quiet for a moment. You should know, he said, that I will be a difficult employer. I know. I have high expectations and I communicate them directly, and I do not... I know, she said. I've spent 10 days watching you operate. I have a fairly complete picture. She looked at him. I have high expectations too, and I communicate them directly, and I don't do well with being managed into a smaller space. No, he said, with the near expression she'd come to read as the closest he got to dry amusement. I have observed that. Then we understand each other, she said. Yes, he said. I believe we do. The lake moved. The cold pressed gently against her face and hands. Somewhere in the trees at the property's edge, the bird made its sound again. The one she'd heard the first night. The one she still couldn't name. She'd looked it up on the third day during a break. A wood thrush. Unusual this late in the season, the field guide had said. They typically migrated south by October. This one had stayed. She thought there was probably something in that, but she was too tired and too emptied and too honest with herself to reach for the metaphor. She just noted it, stayed. That was enough, Muds. She left the lake at 11 and slept for 9 hours without dreaming. In the morning, she called her sister in Atlanta, the first call she'd made to anyone who knew her before last Tuesday. Her sister's voice came through the phone with the particular texture of someone who has been worried and is trying to sound like they haven't been. And Nyla sat on the edge of the east wing bed and held the phone and said she was okay. She'd explain later she was okay. You sound different, her sister said. Do I? Yeah, you sound like... A pause. I don't know. Like something stopped weighing on you. Nyla thought about that. She looked at the lake through the window. Gray-blue in the morning, calm now, the previous day's violence entirely invisible on its surface. Something did, she said. I'll explain when I see you. Are you coming home? She thought about home. The apartment in the South Loop with the broken blinds. The office she'd been navigating for 2 years, with its back corner desk and its ceiling that the overhead lights didn't quite reach. The city that had contained her life before last Tuesday. The grid she'd moved through invisibly, seen by no one who mattered. I'm going to be in Chicago in a few weeks, she said. There are some things I need to handle there, but I don't think I'm going back to what I had before. Her sister was quiet for a moment. Good, she said, finally. You were getting smaller, Nye. Every time I saw you, I didn't know how to say it. Nyla looked at the lake. I was, she said. I know. 3 weeks later, in the second week of November, Chicago's financial district hosted a private gathering at a venue on the 43rd floor of a building on Michigan Avenue, with a view of the lake that went all the way to the horizon. It was not a celebration in any obvious sense. No announcement, no press. The guest list was approximately 60 people, and it crossed lines that guest lists in this city typically didn't cross: corporate, political, certain other categories represented by men with very good suits and very quiet phones who stood at the edges of the room and watched the center of it. The center of it was Kang Tai-jun. He moved through the room the way she'd watched him move through every room, with the contained authority of someone for whom a room's social architecture was simply terrain to be navigated, rather than a performance to be given. He spoke to people directly, briefly, with the precision she'd come to understand was not coldness, but honesty. The efficiency of someone who said what he meant and expected the same. Nyla was beside him, not behind him, not across the room, holding a drink and waiting to be acknowledged. Beside him, in a charcoal suit that she'd bought in the last week of October with money she hadn't been ashamed to spend, with her work on a server 3 floors below this one, and her name on the door of an office in a building in the West Loop that had windows on 3 sides. She was not performing anything. That was the thing she'd noticed most in the past 3 weeks. How much of her previous professional life had been performance? The performance of taking up less space. The performance of being unthreatening. The performance of competence packaged in apology, in qualification, in the constant background hum of, sorry to bother you, but She'd shed it the way you shed wet clothes after coming inside. Not all at once, not consciously, but layer by layer in the days following the estate, until she'd looked at herself in the mirror one morning and found a person who looked approximately the right size. A man she didn't know approached, older, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone who had held institutional authority for long enough that it had become structural. He looked at her with the particular assessment of someone encountering a new element in a familiar equation. "And you are?" he said. Taejun answered, beside her, before she could. "Nyla Brooks," he said. "She runs financial intelligence for our operations. She is also the person responsible for the coordinated freeze of Belandi's Eastern European accounts last month." He paused. "I imagine you read about that." The man's eyes shifted, adjusted, recalibrated. "That was—" He stopped, looked at her. "That was you." "Yes," she said. He looked at her for another moment, the full reassessment happening in real time, the equation rewriting itself. She watched it happen, and she did not help it along or soften it or make it easier. She just stood there and let him look. "Remarkable work," he said, and he meant it. "Thank you," she said, and she received it, not with deflection, not with the automatic minimizing she'd spent years performing. She just received it, the way you received a correct answer on a calculation you'd already verified independently. She wasn't small anymore. She was aware somewhere in the back of her mind of how long she had been. Not timid. She'd never been timid. Even at her most invisible, she'd been stubborn and precise and relentless in the dark of a back corner office where nobody watched. But small in the sense of contained, compressed, fitted into a shape that other people had decided was appropriate for her, and that she'd accepted because she hadn't yet found a room that was built for her actual dimensions. She'd found the room. She'd built some of it herself. Later, when the gathering had thinned and the lake outside had gone fully dark, and the city lights laid themselves across the water in long broken lines, she stood at the window alone for a moment, Taejun in a conversation across the room, the other guests dispersing into smaller groups, and she looked at the city. Her city! She'd lived here her whole life. She knew it by transit line and walking time and neighborhood character and the specific quality of light off the lake in October. It was the city that had contained her invisible years, the back offices, the cold hot chocolate, the Tuesday nights that were supposed to be routine, the city that had watched Gregory Caldwell's name in a headline and Anton Vance in handcuffs and 42 frozen accounts cascading through Eastern European financial institutions on a Thursday afternoon. The city hadn't changed. She had. She thought about Tuesday night, the specific, ordinary, completely unremarkable Tuesday night that had reorganized everything. She thought about what would have happened if she'd filed the surface report and gone home. She thought about the version of herself that might have done that had been tired enough, beaten down enough, convinced enough of her own invisibility to look away from a number that didn't add up. She was glad she hadn't been that version. She was glad she'd been stubborn and precise and constitutionally incapable of looking away from the truth. She was glad she'd pulled the thread. She heard Taejun's footsteps behind her. She'd learned them by now. The particular weight and rhythm, distinguishable from every other footstep in a room. He came to stand beside her at the window, the lake spreading out below them both. The horizon where the water met the sky, a clean, dark line. "Ready to go," he said. She looked at the city one more time. At the lights and the water and the 43 floors of distance between herself and the street where she'd been ordinary. She turned away from the window. "Yes," she said. They walked out together. Behind them, the city held its lights against the dark water, indifferent and enormous and entirely unchanged. And somewhere in the back offices of firms that lined Wacker Drive and Michigan Avenue, other invisible people bent over other spreadsheets in the recycled air of other late-night offices, pulling at threads that didn't add up, waiting for the particular stubborn courage that would make them unable to look away. The city didn't know their names yet. It would.